Good evening. I will now call this meeting to order. Our first order of business is to adopt the agenda for tonight's meeting. Commissioners, is there a motion to adopt the final agenda?
So moved.
Motion, can I get a second?
Second.
That motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. The motion carries. Our next order of business is to adopt the minutes from our January 21st, 2025 Planning Commission meeting. Commissioners, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved. Second.
We got a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. The motion carries. We're now moving on to our discussion items. Our first item tonight is item 3.1. Continue the public hearing for the West Creek Village residential development to February 18th Planning Commission meeting. It's my understanding that the applicant is preparing additional materials for the commission to review at the meeting on February 18th. City Planner McCain, do you have anything to add?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So we did notice for the meeting this evening, since they requested to move it, we just asked that the Plan Commission open the public hearing and continue it to the next meeting.
Thank you. I will now open the public hearing. Is there anyone in the chambers who wishes to comment on this item? Hearing no public comment, commissioners, may I have a motion to continue the public hearing?
I'd like to make a motion to continue the public hearing on West Creek Village to the next regular meeting of the Planning Commission on February 18th, 2025.
A motion, could I get a second?
Second.
A motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. We will continue this item to our meeting on February 18th with a presentation prepared by staff. Our second item tonight is item 3.2, discuss Article 1 of the zoning code revision. I will now turn it over to Associate Planner Travis Beardley for a staff presentation.
Good evening, Chair and Commissioners. Tonight is the first night of going through the zoning code in a full review. So part of it's going to be talking about the overall process, and then we'll jump right into the first article that we'll be looking at. We do have some goals with the zoning code. As we go through it, we want to make sure that we're transparent with the community because it will be an effect, and our conversations will not have a public hearing until later in the year. We also want to make sure that staff's available for comments or questions or anything that gets brought up to a planning commissioner, city council member, whoever, get directed so that we can provide an appropriate response on it. We also want to be flexible during the process because it is a lot and there will be changes. There'll be things that we cover that we'll go back to and change and so on and so forth. In addition, the staff is also looking at updating the municipal side of the code, and we want to make sure that the municipal and the zoning code line up with each other so we get more longevity out of the changes. The other thing that we want to do is we want to unite the municipal and zoning code back together underneath one city code so it's not split. And the overall goal is early 2026 to have this process done. I know it sounds like a long ways away, but it's not as far as we would probably like. Just a quick background on how we got there. There's recognitions of the shortfalls in the zoning code. Staff went through and reviewed the zoning code multiple times in its entirety, and at one point we had over 500 items to comment on that staff has gone through. And then we've also made sure last year to address some of the more immediate items with the Planning Commission and the City Council. So we passed things such as updating our business districts, our conditional use permits, and interim permits, the sign ordinance, and the fence ordinance. Those were things that needed more immediate attention. Now we're looking at everything in a greater, broader sense. The process for this is going to be taking a look at the bulk standards and our performance standards and our overlay districts and our administrative and clerical updates. So out of all those over 500 comments, a lot of that goes into this. Some of it's just bringing stuff up to the modern standard. Some of it's language changes. Some of it's formatting and things like that. So not everything is something immediate that needs to be done as part of the comments. Like I said, we're gonna be making some changes, building permits and predatory offenders, those are municipal code items that are currently inside our zoning code. So we'll be looking at moving those over through this updated process. With that being said, what's gonna be presented to the planning commission is gonna be the updates of our current code in a new format. So it won't be a complete red line from our current code to what's being presented. We're gonna work on redlining the items brought forward. And this whole process, we're looking at least 12 meetings to go through the zoning code on its own. That doesn't include any revisions or having to look back at things or extend times that we're looking at different articles throughout the code, nor does it include time to look at the subdivision ordinance or any other items that might come up during this process. Like I said, when we're tracking changes, as staff, we're gonna keep a master copy of all the comments, of all the changes, and we'll create a red line version to be presented of everything as we go through. Tonight, as commissioners, everybody has a copy of just this one article. We have a printed binder and we'll have a digital copy as well going through and marking all that up. And those comments will be not only from the planning commission, but anything that we hear from the community or from the city council or from the city attorney or other staffers, other things pop up. We'll make sure to keep that flexibility moving forward. Overall, what the plan is once we get a full red line done of the entire code, we'll make sure to get a copy out to the planning commission so everybody has enough time to review it outside of the meetings to where we're comfortable to hold a public hearing. And we'll hold a public hearing on the changes that are presented tonight, next week, or next meeting, and so on and so forth, and all the red line from then. When we're looking at everything, in front of you is a general list and order of everything that we're gonna wanna go through. Tonight, we're just looking at the in general section, which is Article 1. That is gonna include definitions and just some clerical and administrative things that we need to get through with the code and a foundational basis. We'll move on to Article 2. We'll spend a few meetings on Article 3, then Article 4, so on and so forth. This is a little bit of a restructuring, and it might not tie directly into if you're looking for specific language in the titles between what's being presented and what's in the current code. If you do need help finding that, or if anybody in the community needs help finding that, staff is more than available to help track down the changes where the differences are and help understanding through the process. So moving in, before we jump into this first section to take a look at it, were there any comments or questions from the Planning Commission on kind of where we're at, how we got there, and then moving forward?
I have a general comment or suggestion. When you talk about keeping red line changes, I don't know if this is what you're talking about, but my suggestion would be to also keep a change log of why the change was made. So when it does make final approval, 5 years from now, we can have a log to go back to say, all right, this is why we changed it. Remembering decisions 5 years from now is very, very difficult. So I don't know if that's already in place. If that is, that's great. But just a recommendation is to keep a log of, there's a red line version, but there's also like, hey, we made this change, this update. This is the reason why, or whatever detail you want to put in there. And I don't know if that needs to be public or what, but just like, that way you can go back.
Commissioner, that's an excellent point. That's something that we are doing because we'll have to type up the memo. We'll have to make sure that we can present it to residents. So that's an excellent suggestion. And we'll take a look internally at that process to make sure that what we've created so far, we can continue and meet all the requirements that we need to.
Okay.
So going into Article 1, it's going to cover different sections, the definition, scope and purpose, applicability according to other codes, rules of construction, area regulations, substantially similar uses, the review process by the Planning Commission for designs, and then temporary family health care dwellings. So the first thing that we're looking at is the definitions, and you notice right underneath the title it says amended. So what that means is we've taken what's existing and we've changed it or we've added to it or taken away from it, but it's nothing created brand new, so it's things that have been seen before. The definitions section has about 250 definitions in it. That's a consolidated effort to get the definitions throughout the zoning code into one area, as well as make sure that some of the questions that have come up in the past or in different experiences, to make sure we have it defined. If we have a use, we need a definition for it so that we can regulate it better, so we have a better frame of reference. The definitions have been looked at by staff and not just planning staff, but we've reached out to other departments as well, as some of the definitions do have some crossing. Some of the things to note in the definitions that we've done is we've updated or added definitions for yards and setbacks. Those definitions have been changed in the proposed draft that's in front of you tonight compared to what's in the current code. A lot of that is just cleaning up the language and making it better, so when we go through the code and set performance standards, it can be better and more easily explained, and it meets similar language to what we have in neighboring communities as well as most of the metro. We have parking versus storing of vehicles. That is being put in so that we can have, yet again, a performance standard of defining parking with a set time limit. After that, it becomes storing. Different parts, that'll even go over to the municipal code to deal with traffic and vehicles as well. So it goes beyond. Building height, we went ahead and we amended that to meet the shoreland code. Currently, the two definitions that we have for building height and shoreland is different than what we have in our general section under 16-1. So this corrects that. Schools is one of those misunderstood definitions. There is a statute definition for schools, and that would be the definition that we would be using. So that's your pre-K, that's your public institutions, but it wouldn't be like mathnasium or any of those type of things. Yes, Commissioner? Oh, my apologies. The other thing that we looked at was impervious and pervious surface coverage. Earlier, the city planner had brought in a proposal to do a 2% coverage in our definitions for our R1 district, that you could do a permeable surface in addition to the maximum impervious. And because of how the shoreland ordinance was written, now it's applied everywhere. In addition to that, we noticed that there was a couple issues with the definition of impervious within our code that we've made sure to address by making these updates. And it further comply with DNR standards as well. The other thing that we looked at was cannabis. A lot of rules with that. There's still a lot of changes coming with that, but we made sure to get a definition of what every single license type that we would have or type of use we would have in the community, just to kind of line everything up. There were a few other changes, but nothing too substantial. The next thing we look at is the amended section for the scope, purpose, and intent. Basically what this is saying what the zoning code is, how it's used, and why it's important. This is pretty standard language. This was reviewed by the city attorney. He didn't have any comments on it. But we do need to say, hey, this is why we have the code, this is how we're going to implement it, and this is what we want to achieve by doing it. The next thing that we look at is applicability and compliance, which is amended. What this says is this is basically your this is saying that you have to conform with the city code. We're not going to allow for nonconformities to be created. So when we look at subdivisions and splitting a parcel, we're not going to create a parcel which exists, which doesn't meet our current code. Or if we do a split, that the building that's on the property will now need to meet this, will still need to meet the setbacks, height requirements, and that type of thing. Something that we did add to the code, so this is completely new language, is coordination with other codes. Basically what this does is this sets the parameters to, if there's a conflict within our ordinances, what prevails. This is standard language that's in the code. It'll help clean up a lot of discrepancies we may have. And this just helps explain what you're going to do. It also permits lawful nonconformities as well. Next thing we have is rules of construction. This is a brand new item as well. This goes back and says, basically, it helps with some of the definitional challenges that we could have. The term lot and parcel are two different things, but they're used interchangeably. A lot is a property description. A parcel is the summary of the property description, but we'll put them back and forth, the same with saying property or plot or piece and things like that. So that's just one example of what it is. It also defines that when we use the terms like should and may, or shall and must, to show that interchangeability and the applicability of that type of language. We have area regulations. This says straight out, you cannot create a nonconformity. We won't pass anything that creates it. The other thing that staff is looking into on this is creating some catch-all language that says if the code doesn't permit it, it's not allowed. We currently have language within the business districts of our current code, as well as in the proposed code in other areas, to have that catch-all language. But as staff census went out, it was suggested that moving it here will take care of any confusion. And if there are amendments made in the future, it'll make sure that you don't have to amend multiple places if you want to change those rules. So it simplifies it and it makes it better and cleaner going forward. We have the determination of substantially similar use. This is an addition. Basically, what this language says is that if somebody comes up and says that they want to open a business and their business isn't clearly defined in the city code, is it similar enough to another business that that's how we're going to view it as a city? They would do a request through staff or the zoning administrator. It would come to the planning commission, go to the city council. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't trigger the public hearing and it doesn't trigger a zoning text amendment. An example for this, if it was to happen, is a Papa Murphy's. That it's a take and bake. It's not really a restaurant. It's not really a convenience store. It's not really retail. So where do you classify it? How do you set the regulations for what it is? Because we don't have a clear definition of how that business would operate. So this would be one of those things that they were to come to town, they'd say, hey, what category do we fall underneath? The staff will come to the planning commission, discussion, provide a recommendation to city council. City council says, yep, that's what it is. And then we use those regulations in there. So if it is considered a restaurant, we'll use the restaurant regulations. But Papa Murphy's is, like I said, it's unique. They don't have seating inside because they don't cook anything on site. You take the pizza home. So it's a goofy spot. The next thing is the design review process by the planning commission. This ordinance has not been touched by staff. It was recently adopted in 2023 was the last update. And there wasn't anything in there that raised a cause of concern for staff. Going forward. I got one. Okay. So we look at boundary lines. This is amended. Basically what it did is has if a property is in two different zoning districts, the last district will prevail. There was some language from 2017 that had a 20% improvement rule and this other stuff. This ordinance is amended to clean up that type of language that's currently in the code. Mistakes do happen when we zone properties, and you might have a home or a business which sits on what we see as one parcel, or one property, but it has multiple parcels in it, and the zoning might have split on that. So now you go to the less restrictive, and you can make a determination going forward without having to come to the planning commission and request a rezoning or any changes to the zoning map in that effect. Temporary family health care dwellings is the last item that we're going to look at tonight. This is an addition. This comes from a law back in 2016, which allows for basically you to put a tiny home on your property if you are in need of medical care, whether it be physical or mental care. You could have a family member or caretaker live in a tiny home in your backyard, and the city would have to permit it. There are special rules to it, but basically 300 square feet, can't have a permanent foundation. It's got to be able to be transported by a pickup, and it's got to connect to water and utilities. Things that we can't do would include saying, hey, it needs to match the color of the home, or it needs to be in a certain area. There's special rules that go with it. In 2016, it was put out, and the recommendation was to opt out of it, and most of the cities and counties throughout the state opted out of this. There are a few cities, but that's your Minneapolis, that's your St. Paul, that's your Rochester, St. Cloud, Duluth, your larger communities, which have much more diverse housing, and especially smaller lots, and things like that, where maybe an ADU isn't something they'd be able to do. With that, staff is looking for discussion on the three topics that are here. One, are the definitions clear and easily understood? That's a big goal, especially moving forward. We're going to be using those for the next few months as we go through the review. The next thing is, should the zoning code allow for an alternative process? That's a substantially similar use process. And Papa Murphy's is the example that goes in there. Staff, we kind of talked about it, and where would we put it? And there's no clear way to go, and we don't want that confusion in the future. There could always be a zoning text amendment that's always on the table as well. The other thing is, should temporary family health care dwellings be prohibited? With that, staff is looking just for feedback on the discussion, but we also stand for any questions or comments outside of that as well.
Thank you. I will now open the floor for the planning commission to discuss. Commissioners, any comments or questions?
I have four questions regarding the definitions, and I promise not to get into details, but these are four, I think, substantive questions. The first is with respect to the definition of accessory structure. I think we all felt somewhat constrained on the Smithtown Road discussion of that as accessory structure, and I wonder if we could perhaps solve two problems. One, by addressing the question of whether a breezeway makes it an attachment and not an accessory structure, and secondly, whether there should be a size limit on accessory structures. You know, the accessory structure in question 2 meetings ago, I think it was as large or maybe even larger than the primary structure. And I don't think that's what anybody ever intended. And I think this is an opportunity for us to address that. So I don't know if others agree with that or not, but I hope we can address that in the next revisions of the zoning code.
Chair, Planning Commissioner, just to point out with accessory structures, we did send notice to the paper to bring back accessory structures at the March 4th meeting, and those items are addressed in the changes. The breezeway part's not in there because that's a building code, and that helps with the attached part of that. So that type of clarification we looked at. Size limitations are also in there. I'd be more than happy to show you an advanced copy of the draft.
No, that's fine. I just want to make sure that we address that issue because I felt like we were constrained unnecessarily last time.
Oh, and even a definition of a breezeway versus an attachment.
And what it does is it'll fall underneath the performance standards. So just looking at the accessory real quick, we'll bring it back in more detail 2 meetings from now. But real quick, what we're looking at doing is creating basically a stopgap measure where we want to get everything aligned. We want to make sure the standards for accessory structures are put in place appropriately. And then as we go through the review, that's a different type of formatting that we'll be looking at in 3 meetings from now, 2 or 3 meetings from now. I have to look at the list, is when we would be bringing that back. And you see the new format, kind of how that lays out. But it's definitely something that staff has been looking at and is 100% on the list and something we want to get corrected before the building season commences.
So if I could just add one interesting part to the accessory structure. I guess it's going to be energized this week. But my company developed for a county, Dakota County, a carport canopy. And so when we started with that project in the city that it was to be built, there was the need to first seek an amendment to a zoning code to allow a structure to be larger than 900 square feet so that we could get a variance to build this carport, which was going to save the county energy at its operation. So it was one of those where there was a constraint in size, thinking about what we probably are all thinking about is structures in property, but then we're seeing it as an energy generating resource on a parking lot. So again, we went through with success with the county, with the city, but it was it was one of those, I don't think anyone had thought about it until it became kind of this idea that that they were interested in pursuing. So it's the flip side of how to think about that one. And I don't know how frequent or common it is, but that's one of those where the 900-foot constraint became the reason for going to the city and seeking some alternates.
And Chair, Commissioners, or the carports, the type of uses that are in there are all performance standards. We have those in the code. I know it's early. One thing that you'll notice with these definitions compared to current definitions, these definitions have 0 performance standards listed in the definition. And that's done intentionally so that we can regulate it underneath our performance standards sections.
Awesome
So
to know.
you'll notice that some of those changes are in there. There's only a handful, but we intentionally pulled those out, as well as dates, saying something was legal before this date. That has been removed as well, because it's called a legal nonconformity, which is already regulated, so there's no point to have the extra information in there.
Interesting, okay.
But, certainly for myself, looking through the entire packet and my experience on the planning commission is that the planning commission and city council really has to view an awful lot of this through the eyes of your next door neighbor.
Yeah.
And because your next door neighbor has a substantial investment that may be affected in a derogatory way by what we approve at the same time. So, I think that's a big item.
Yeah.
And you talk about preventative, that will prevent an awful lot of issues when we truly go through each individual item.
Joseph, do you want to
Definitely
continue?
know the meeting you're talking about.
Joseph, do you want to continue?
Yeah. The second question is around the definition of junkyard,
Yes.
which is maybe a trivial point.
No.
It's a very broad definition. The term junk is not defined, but it caused me to wonder, are we talking about, auto parts recovery places, or are we talking about sanitary landfills? There wasn't a definition of landfill, so I don't know if a landfill is a junkyard, and exactly what we're talking about here.
Absolutely, Commissioner. So junk, even if you go to the state and you look at some of the administrative law cases and some of the other criminal cases in the state, junk is defined differently. There's no clear-cut answer for it. So moving forward with that, when we do look at junk and we look at that type of stuff, we have to define it by the type of use that it is. Items such as a junkyards isn't anything that we have listed on any of the proposed use tables, so therefore it wouldn't be permitted. But because we don't have landfills, we don't have salvage. If we were to do, say, a junkyard, what we would see as a junkyard would be a salvage yard for vehicles. We would define it as a salvage yard for vehicles and then set the performance standards in place on that.
So then do we need to define junkyard if we're never gonna permit it?
No, we don't. If
Should we
it's,
just cut that out so there's no confusion about, because what could happen then is someone's gonna come back and be like, well, you have a definition, but you don't have it as a permitted use.
Correct.
I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking that.
Well, just merely for the purpose of example, that was one of the things that I had noted also, was junkyard. And merely as an example, is that if you drive down from Bavaria to Highway 5, and there's some homes that were there and have been there before any of the development around them occurred. And one could say junkyard, or one could say an overflow of collection. And what is the fine line between that? And I think, somewhere along the line, And it would typically be in some of the more established neighborhoods that have been there for, 40-some years, and then are developed around at the same time. So I think I agree.
Maybe we can just get rid of the definition altogether if we don't really need it.
Chair, Commission, more than happy to strike the definition out. Just to kind of touch on that example, junk will need to be defined in the municipal code, will be one thing, because junk will be something that will be part of our nuisance code, which is the municipal code. And then overflow of parking is something that actually falls underneath the zoning code and performance standards. So it's gonna be fun.
Yeah.
So, but no, getting rid of.
Jump to one is a collection to someone else.
Exactly, so it is difficult to define, but as far as junkyard, I got it noted on here to remove from the code. So when this would come back to be reviewed again, it would still be listed, but it'd be redlined out. So we'd be able to see that we,
Third one is nonconformity, and this may be just my ignorance. I think of a nonconformity as something that doesn't comply. The definition would suggest that it's something that when begun did comply, but no longer does comply with the current standard. And I think it's confusing because it sort of collides with something that doesn't collide now with the current standard. You have a pre-existing nonconformity and sort of a current nonconformity. So again, it may be just my misunderstanding, and if so, I'll yield. I just wondered if that could be clarified in some respect.
Commissioner, absolutely. Chair, Commission, the nonconformity actually falls under Article 2 of the proposed language for the city, or excuse me, the zoning code as we go through it. And it's better to find through there. The regulations that are in Article 1 is just setting basically the foundation, the basis of how we're gonna implement the code. But we do have listed here for nonconformities, it'll be Article 2, Division 3. And we have generalized standards, we have uses as well as structures, non-conforming lots, and that type of stuff. So we'll be bringing that back at the next planning commission meeting for that language for more specific review.
Okay, I just didn't want to create confusion with current nonconformities. And then the last point is water-oriented accessory structures. I stumbled over this one because it's defined as a small above-ground building or other improvement which, because of the relationship of its use to surface water, reasonably needs to be located closer to public waters than the normal structural setback. And then examples include watercraft, storage, gazebos, screenhouses, fish houses, pump houses, saunas. And those didn't seem to me essentially or necessarily needing to be close to water and within a setback. And this one is almost a performance standard because of the definition and its examples. And I just wondered if that was intentional or if it was just confusing.
Chair, Commission, that it is intentional language. That is language that's been set up by the DNR through the Shoreland Overlay District. With that, in the Shoreland Overlay District, there are certain performance standards that would have to be met, but this defines what it is and what the DNR is looking at and what they've said, hey, as a city, we're okay with you guys doing this. Big thing with the overlay districts is if we limit the number of, say, accessory structures to 2, so you can have your garage and then you can have a large shed, right? And you meet all the standards. If you're on a lake, if you're on a riparian property, then at that point you'd be able to put in a gazebo or a fish house or boathouse, something that you do to enjoy with the body of water that you're adjacent to.
So it's a permissive use then, and really, I guess my concern is that it sounds like it absolutely must be within the otherwise required setback.
Generally, with these, I prefer not to be quoted here without looking up the exact language, but what it does is that there's restrictions in height or in your footprint that you can have depending on the type of use, as well as how close something can be to the ordinary high water mark is where the performance standard sits. That is, all that type of information comes from the Shoreline Overlay, which the DNR put out in 2018 and had cities go ahead and approve or ask for variances from it prior to the 2040 comp plans being adopted.
Basically, it lets you put a gazebo closer to the water than it would let you put a garage or a storage thing, right? Like, so it sets it up for a little more flexibility. It seems like it's the way I interpret it.
And I don't have any problem with that, but to say that it must be located closer to public waters than the normal structure setback seems to strain the definition, because it doesn't absolutely have to be closer. It's just that the DNR says it can be closer because it is useful to have closer to the water.
I don't see the word must, but maybe I'm missing it.
The phrase is reasonably needs to be located closer to public waters than the normal structural setback.
Yeah, so the way I read it is like, structure means a small amount above ground building or other improvements, except stairways, these things, which because of its relationship reasonably needs to be. So it's saying like, because of its relationship to the water, it needs to be closer to it.
Has to be.
Because of it. It's not saying you have to put it closer. It's saying because you need this dock to be in the water, it has to be closer than what a normal setback would allow you to do. So it's not saying that you have to do it. It's not the way I interpret it, at least.
And Chair, Commissioners, that's a good summary of what it is. There's a 100-foot setback required for shoreline properties from the ordinary high water mark. If you were to put a gazebo or a pergola or a sauna, right, those are non-structural items. So it's considered landscaping, except if it has a hard surface with it. So what would happen is you wouldn't be able to put anything within the 100-foot. So the DNRs came out and said, okay, there are certain things that we're going to say is okay to put between the 100-foot setback mark and the water. And that's where this definition falls into play. And then in the shoreline code, there's specific rules attached to that as well.
Fair enough.
Or can you just change from reasonably needs to may,
Yeah. That might be.
I got hung up on needs.
that may
Needs to
be
be.
located closer, rather than
The
saying
reasonably,
reasonably needs to,
We can do that.
I mean,
yeah, we could probably reword it a little better.
Yeah, we can take out reasonable needs, and we can put in,
maybe,
uh,
or something.
maybe,
Or
yeah,
reference it.
yeah, we'll just,
May as permitted by the DNR or whatever,
Yeah, makes sense.
be located closer to.
yeah, we'll take out so it'll read, starting a relationship of its use to the surface water, comma, may be located closer to public waters than normal. That's definitely a red line. We can do that. That cleans up the language.
Yeah,
I think my only problem with that is like the reason the reasonably needs is there is because the person who's going to use the water oriented needs to prove that whatever they're putting there has a reasonable need to be closer to the shoreland than what's allowed. So I think that's why it's worded that way. And I'm just saying that out loud. We can decide not to do that, but I think that's kind of the reason it's worded that way, is that if someone's going to come and say, well, I have a thing and it's a water-oriented accessory, they need to prove that that thing reasonably needs to be located closer to the shore than what is permitted, the 100-foot setback, whatever it is. So that's like why it's phrased that way in my mind. Again, if I'm in the minority, I'm not going to sit here and stop.
No, it's true.
No, I see the point, and it becomes a question for the person trying to be able to get that approval.
Right.
If it may be.
Right, I may be able to put anything
Is there a
there.
level of subjectivity to, well, does it?
They would need to come to us and say, it reasonably has to be this close because I can only put a 50-foot hose on it, and that's, as close as I can get to a body of water. I don't know, making something up, right? Like,
But I mean, I understand it's
Yeah,
kind of a means test term.
right. And I think we could probably reword it a little bit to make it clear. I do agree with Commissioner Joseph that there's probably a better way to phrase it.
Chair, Commission, before we make a change to it, staff will reach out to the DNR to get some clarification on this and bring up both points and see if there is a change that they would like us to do or what options there, and we'll bring that back to present the results of that discussion.
anything else?
No.
I have a couple of just like general ones, and I'll send these back to you guys in an email because I've like noted them, redlined them myself. There's a couple spots where we have abbreviations. Like I saw CB, Central Business District, CBD, a couple times. And there is a definition for Central Business District, but it's not hyphen CBD. There's a couple examples like that I would just encourage staff to go through and comb a couple times. I know that's like part of the long-term process. I had another general one, sorry, let me.
And Chair Commission, to that point, part of it, you're gonna see throughout the code as it's presented, there's gonna be some of that type of clerical layout as we go through, because there hasn't been a final format instead of that. As the code's been written over the years, CBD, for an example, would be sometimes spelled out, sometimes not, sometimes not hyphenated, italicized, sometimes not. So it's going and figuring out that layout and that format. The big thing as we go through the process is getting the more substantive thing. But if there's grammatical things that come up or kind of layout things that are seen that could help show things easier as we go through, 100% let us know as staff, and that way we can take that into account as we do the updates.
And then my other general one is if this is a question or best practice question, I'm not sure how to phrase this. Like the one Commissioner Joseph just brought up, like list specific things. And my question is, when we put lists like that under these definitions, does that start to box us in at all? Even if it's just saying, for example, like, and not all the time does it say, for example. You know, examples may include, but are not limited to. When there are lists behind these definitions, does that cause any long-term, like the definition isn't clear enough that we have to provide examples? Do we need to redo the definition? You know what I'm asking? Like I'm worried about many of these have, and for example, you know, I just don't know if later down the road people are going to get too boxed into, well, that wasn't listed as an example.
So Commissioner and Chair, that's a great question. When we look back in some of the stuff on here, what it is, it falls back underneath this section of the determination of substantially similar use. Okay. If we do have something that has an example, like the water-oriented, lists out specific things in there, but a resident comes forward and say, hey, I've got X idea, I want to build a widget down by the lake, but it doesn't really fit in here. This would be a mode to go through to be able to get that answer without needing to go through a much larger process. We can go through and ask a question, and in 2 weeks, 3 weeks maybe, they get the answer. So that's kind of where that goes. As much as when we get done with this, I would love to say, hey, this is the best zoning code that ever existed and it's going to last for 50 years. We already know that if we codify in 26, in 28, we're already going to start making amendments to it, because we'll have to go back through this when we start looking at the comprehensive plan as well. Sure. So, no, but that is a good point, but that's where some of this stuff comes in for flexibility for the staff and the city to do it. So staff, we can make a determination, someone doesn't like it, here's a process that doesn't cost any money to the resident to be able to get an answer.
And I guess while we're on this, so then this would be brought, is that just between the applicant and staff? Is that something brought between council or? An
example would be, you want to put we'll say with the water oriented, you want to put a sawmill down by the lake, right? In here, underneath these definitions, a sawmill, and as from a staff perspective, isn't an enjoyment of the lake, because you want to float logs out there and you have whatever hobby, right? But as staff, we don't view it that way because we're taking into account everything else. So what you would do is you'd be able to go to the zoning administrator and say, hey, I don't like that I'm being told no, can you ask the planning commission? And what happens is that you write an email or drop off a letter saying, hey, this is what I'm trying to do, this is why I believe it should be allowed, and this is why I believe it's a similar use. Comes to the planning commission discusses it, provides a recommendation to the city council, and the city council determines, is it or is it not a similar use?
Okay.
So this is a method to, when we do have those box in kind of situations, this is the method to resolve those situations.
Thanks for explaining that. I don't have anything else.
I mean, there's an awful lot of detail that could be analyzed, but one that came to mind was the definition of deck and a roofless structure. And if you go in the vicinity of 10, 11, there's a lot of enclosed, what would be probably three-season porch. And it's a deck-like structure that has a roof. And I noticed many of them that were on the, one of our new developments.
I thought we had a, yeah, it's a good call out. I thought we had a 3-season though.
Page 19.
Chair, Commissioners, I apologize, I thought we had in here definition for porch. That doesn't need added, so a three-season, or a porch regards 3-season, 4-season, 1-season, whatever the case, a porch is considered a deck that has a roof over it. That falls underneath and affects impervious cover for properties as well. So I've got, oh man, this one's old. So we'll make sure to get that in there, but there's a difference between the definition of a deck, a porch, and a pergola. And it all comes down to what type of cover is underneath. And with that being said, pergola is not in here either, so we're gonna do that as well. Just to help clean that up. So deck, no roof, porch, hard roof, pergola has screening or wood slats or what have you.
So and one of the, on page 13, alley. And by definition, a finger street would fall into the category of an alley. Is finger street not a more common term?
Commissioner, I believe finger street would be a slang term when it comes to zoning. We'd be looking at, is it residential, is it collector, is it a minor, is it an arterial? And those definitely.
Privately owned.
If it's privately owned, that'd be a private street. And that goes back to our comprehensive plan to where that type of stuff is defined, as well as into the city engineer's technical and design manual. And it also goes into like our subdivision ordinance and that type of stuff. So that'd be down to the type of street, and then there's restrictions within the subdivision ordinance to what can be constructed on there. And like I said, the city engineer has to approve the design of the street as well, even if it's a private. With West Creek Village, which we did see tonight, they have private streets in there. In the subdivision ordinance, it specifically states different things that they can and can't do.
Now, and I'm on a HOA, and we just went through all of our bylaws and getting ready for an annual meeting. And one of the topics I brought up was what would be loosely defined as cottage industries, where people are doing a variety of different things. And one in particular is a guy whose hobby is working on cars, and apparently is very skillful at the same time. And so, for an HOA, we can control that if it's your next door neighbor that's doing that impacts, the neighborhood in general. And I think that, if we can address some of those things, some of what would be, there's a lot of families that are doing daycare, child daycare. And I don't know if that has to be spelled out in any way. But if there's one of them talked about in a previous neighborhood his whole garage was a woodworking shop, and saws going at various hours and everything else. And again, you know, it's neighborhood, becomes really the key, because these people are buying with the expectation, with a defined expectation. And so, you know, not to use the word control, but I think it becomes more preventative, in general terms. And now would be the opportune time to address some of those things.
So, Chair, Commission, to your point, Commissioner, when we look at the schedule where we have Article 3 district regulations all, as well as the residential, we'll be coming up with looking at that.
Good.
I'd be more than happy to talk to you about what cottage industry laws are with the Department of Agriculture compared to daycare, which is actually regulated by a completely different department at the state level. But cottage laws, for an example, would be somebody who bakes cookies and sells cookies out of their home. But there's regulations on deliveries, there's regulations on traffic, there's a health standard that goes with it, and there's all these different things. Mechanics, that's a mechanic shop being used for to work on other people's vehicles is currently prohibited underneath our code, and would be further prohibited underneath our residential zoning code. But when these are good things to bring up when we get into 2 meetings from now, 3 meetings from now, and 4 meetings from now. In addition with that, staff is fully prepared to take those meetings and extend them between multiple meetings and not rush through anything. We want to make sure we get the best bite out of an apple when we start it.
One of the maybe a bit of humor in the whole thing, but one of them was a comment in a medium-sized outstate town, a structure for poultry in the backyard. And, you know, while we don't anticipate that, but it, you know, certainly it's very common in many other parts of the world. And it's something that, you know, again, you know, I look at it as preventative positions that we can take. One other thing, just,
Go ahead.
if I could, one other thing, just real briefly. An apartment building, 3+ families, is that a, by definition, is that how an apartment would be defined?
Commissioner, correct. There's Minnesota rules. I'm sorry, you can't really see this on camera. It always is small print. But we looked at that, and then we also verified it with the Minnesota rules underneath the building code. So you have single family, 2 family, 3 family, and once you get above that 3 family, it gets regulated as an apartment, as a commercial structure at that point, as far as building code's concerned. But we still treat it underneath the residential code. Right now, it'd be under our R4. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as long as we have that definition, that's fine with me.
I have a question, basically under alteration. Does alteration means major alteration to a sign?
So, Chair, the alteration, the definition laid out means any major alteration to a sign, but shall not be included in routine maintenance, painting, or what have you. So that alteration is specific to signs, because that definition is used specifically within the sign ordinance part. When we look at alterations to a building, those are considered remodels or additions or subtractions from the building. So the definition relies specifically towards where it kind of fits within the code. We could expand that if,
Yeah, I guess I'm just saying, like, couldn't you call it sign alteration?
we can definitely, that's a great thing.
To that point, I was pulling this up, there's a structural alterations already there, so it'd be more consistent.
Some of this stuff is just kind of minor stuff. Like where you have bolt house. Bolt house, everything else is italicized, that's not italicized. And then I got, commissioner means commissioner of the Department of Natural Resources.
County commissioner, that's what I had written down.
Well, there's different types of commissioners, we're planning commissioners.
Absolutely, Chair. So that definition only gets used within our shoreland overlay. So it only gets used with reference to the DNR, and that's a definition that got pulled out of the shoreland ordinance. As far as that goes, we can definitely take a look at adjusting that. Let me just get it in front of me real quick.
If it's only used in that section, can you do a definition only in that section? Or does it need to be in the larger?
The goal is to put all the definitions within one
Okay, gotcha.
code.
I thought you said earlier there'd be some specific, got it, I misunderstood.
Yeah, there can be in certain areas, there might need to be that specific. But the ultimate goal is to get everything into one place. And that way, when we do make adjustments, we're not running into where, decks were very common, where it got changed. The DNR changed their definition of decks to make them an impervious structure. And it was still considered, a pervious structure, but then still considered impervious in general code. So it's trying to avoid things like that. As far as commissioner with this, what we can do is we could, find it real quick, we can just call it DNR commissioner, or just
Sure.
straight out put it out, or actually a better way to do it would be that in the shoreline ordinance, we could just write out the entire title and call it good and avoid all that type of confusion. And that way we don't have to list out planning commissioner, county commissioner, state commissioner for the
Planning.
widget programs, or all that type of stuff. It'd be up to the planning commission on which way they would like to go with that.
Good catch.
I'm fine with whatever you want. I just, you're taking a broad term and dropping it down to DNR. If you can remove it, that's fine, or if you want to put it in the shoreland.
It's just easy to write it out as we go through it.
That's
So,
fine.
If the planning commission's okay with it, we'll just take it out. And then when we do get to the shoreland, we'll make sure to spell it out fully. And I didn't bring my post-it notes, but that's okay.
I can,
One other, oh,
I got quite a few here.
okay.
Under gas pumps, I got reprimanded many years ago about gas. You got gas or fuel. Diesel fuel is not gas, and gas is not diesel fuel. Whether you want to, what you want to call it, I'm just throwing it out there. I know it's a general term, people use gas, but, if it's,
So with the chair commission, with you saying gas or saying fuel or diesel or anything like that, we could definitely underneath gas list out. These are all the things we'll consider gas. The other thing to look at is now you'd have to list out everything. One advantage that we do have is within law is that you can use common definitions, and I'm not trying to step on Bob or anything like that and the city attorney, but there are different sections in there. This is a pretty common thing. So to fall under, simplest way to put it is if you drive a diesel truck, do you say you're gonna go to the diesel station or the gas station? If you drive a vehicle that uses liquid natural gas, do you say, I'm going to the LNG station, or are you going, if you're gonna get propane, are you going to the propane station? So it'd be something to think about like that as well. It's definitely something that we can expand if it's a more comfortability.
But, I mean, you could sell, you know, like Cabin Fever sells propane, but not gasoline or diesel fuel.
So with that, you're talking a large tank you go up to fill propane tanks, but it's not a service station or gas station, right? That's a completely different type of use, is where I'd classify that underneath.
I'm just throwing stuff out there.
Chair, planning commissioners, anything I say, I promise it is just for the discussion,
Yeah.
because we want to get this right, and if we can have the discussion once, maybe twice, to get it to where we're all comfortable, it'll make all our lives easier. I just want to make sure that we're looking at both sides of any type of thing that we're looking at, so that when we make the notes and make the changes, we bring it back and we can say, hey, we discussed it, we talked about it both ways, here's what we came up with.
Another one, ground grade, means the elevation grade closest to the sign to which reference is made. And that one I had to Google. I'm like, what is ground grade? And it says ground grade is also known as land grading or earthwork, process of reshaping the ground to a desired elevation. But again, it references a sign versus, and maybe it's just, is there ground grading in a development that doesn't have a sign?
Chair, yes, there is. Yes, there is. That is a good catch. Going through that, yes, it could relate to a sign, because basically it's just talking about the dirt, but you have slope requirements when you build a home from your home. So now you're talking about the ground grade there and nearest whatever. So, and the only spot that we use the term within our zoning code is within the sign ordinance. However, we need it to line up with the municipal side as well and make sure that it aligns with all the rules above us. I'm not sure. I'm trying to think. Because it would involve height. Or have a building.
Because we list ground grade in our definition for height.
You can look at it.
Yeah, we'll take a look at it, because it's gonna affect other definitions and performance standards if we change it or remove it. So we'll take a look and see what effect it has. So I will,
Another one I got is a recreational vehicle dwelling. It says 400 feet or less. I don't know what some of these recreational vehicles are up to now. Some of these big motor homes or, you know, what, because they seem to be getting bigger and bigger, and they, you know, have their fold outs and so forth, and are you considering, is that too small? Is it?
Chair, commissioners, I kind of knew this one was gonna come up. Between the zoning code and the municipal code, we have recreational vehicles, we have special vehicles, and we have language that if we decided to just swap out the words, it wouldn't make sense between the two. So this is one of those definitions that more or less is a placeholder until we get it figured out to how we want the language between the municipal side as well as the zoning side. The intent behind this is, when you look at it, I just had it, I went to the wrong page. But I do got it. I got a note here actually that says Vic recreational vehicle and special vehicles, because we need those to align. And part of that is because the last time we codified was 1998. Some of the language is from 1975. So you got 50 years worth of phrasing and how things are done. So, but it is noted to get that fixed already.
And then repetitive loss means flood-related damages, sustained to structure, 2 separate occasions.
Yeah.
Is there a way to add tornadoes or something, or is that just something,
That definition is specifically used within our floodplain ordinances.
okay?
So the way that it's defined works for the floodplain, and since that's the only place it's used, it doesn't say that we need to expand it. If we start saying tornadoes and things like that, then we're stepping on some more FEMA things. And that might be outside the scope of what the city does or what the city's responsible for. And definitely outside the scope of staff, though. If it's something we need to do, we will learn it.
I guess the only other thing I really have is if there was a way to consolidate all the signs under one sub.
Chair and Planning Commission is definitely something we looked at when we looked at the sign ordinance. I know that my predecessor was working on the sign ordinance, and it still took 4 months, 5 months after I started in May to
Right,
bring
no,
it forward after it got rewritten. Was I the third person to rewrite it in a year and a half? So it's
Well, like streets, they are all grouped by streets. I was looking at,
But more of that's just the way it's alphabetical that way, so that's why it comes in under streets and,
Yep.
and the whole thing is alphabetical, but to me, if you wanted,
but it was like
All
street,
the-
minor street, or, principal. You might be able to think about just organizing it based on that sign and then what it
then
is.
you'd have to change all the codes, so where it says
Yeah,
dynamic sign, you have to say sign dynamic versus in the sign code. Which you could take this document and throw it in a PDF and search for sign and it'll pop up every sign.
oh, that's,
If you really wanted to search for whatever, you can search for it.
So, another one that also becomes part of the preventative theory is temporary. And by definition, whose definition are we going to use? So someone says, well, but it's temporary.
Commissioner, that's a great question. So in here we have definition of temporary accessory structure, temporary display, temporary sign. So we have
Yep.
3 different temporaries listed in there. What happens is when we go into the performance standards, we're gonna say your temporary for this is a limit of X amount of days, X amount of hours. We would set that limit in the performance standards.
Excellent. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, one of the other ones is that I don't know, I'm not aware that we have, that we've had to deal with solar panels. And if we haven't today, we will tomorrow at the same time. So again, that, in my estimation, that falls into, now would be the time to address that.
I know I saw the term once here.
It's called solar collector, I think, in here.
Yeah, solar collectors, page 33.
Then you go from there to wind.
So,
wind turbines or, and I know some of those are prohibited in the city, but
so Chair, Commissioners, if you look on here, if you look at Article 9, underneath alternative energy, that's where we're gonna have solar regulations, that's where we're gonna have ground pump regulations, turbine regulations and that type of stuff.
will that, should
that-
that be in the definitions?
Yeah, do those need to be defined then? Does turbine and all of those need to be defined? If we don't, I don't see turbine as a,
So if it's considered,
that's a question, you guys can take that away, like, I don't know.
and that's one of the reasons we're doing the definitions, we're gonna add to and take away as we go through this.
Sure.
So that is an excellent point. That would be,
Cause like, I think I remember seeing EV charger somewhere.
Right.
I don't-
yeah, and that's because that's specific use, but if you
Right.
put up a wind turbine, do we have a definition for that? Right now, no. So that's an excellent point of saying, what is this?
Yeah. Yeah, cause if I go throw one up in my backyard, self-make one versus, you know, the big behemoth ones, like putting some sort of definition, I think is probably gonna be smart. We may have not get to what that definition is until we hit Article 9, but we're probably gonna need one.
And this is iterative too. When you
Right.
get into the teeth of Article, whatever, 11.9, you may go back and add definitions.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's part of where the flexibility comes in. We're gonna go back and forth. One of the goals with this, just to help with wrapping everybody's head around how big this is, one of the ideas is once we get through everything, to bring back a complete red line that's noted for the planning commission to take a look at, and then taking 2-3 meetings off of even talking about the zoning code to give everybody a chance to go through on their own time to see if there's anything else they want to talk about and getting those changes done. Though as staff, we have our goal timelines of when we want to hit certain criterias and marks. That would be best case scenario, drive forward. We already know that that's not going to happen. So just because we were going to bring this back at to the last meeting, and that didn't happen because we weren't prepared for it yet. So there's a variety of fun, interesting things with this. I would like to point out if there's questions about specifics, I do have a list with just some real quick, what is it type of stuff of the layout of the proposed zoning code. It's the same thing that was put into the packet for tonight, but it's got a little bit more detail, and it's the entire proposed structure of the new code, not just what we'd be talking about tonight. I just don't want to make the document fully public yet because this has changed multiple times and it will change again. But if anybody wants to take a look at it or discuss it, I'm more than happy to provide it.
So where were we at on the temporary family health care dwelling?
I think the city has opted out previously, and I think that makes sense.
It has become a standard, apparently.
I would say we continue to opt out until they require us to opt in.
Yeah,
I don't know that we really want to get in
no,
because, I mean, then there's also HOA different requirements that having a secondary building on a lot.
Yeah.
And again, what do you consider temporary? What's temporary? Is it 3 years? Is it 10 years? Is it, what's the
where did I get
definition?
around to it?
What's the definition for, until that person passes away, and then what do you do with the structure? Yeah, you're supposed to be able to haul it away in a 1-ton pickup, but,
One-ton pickup.
oh, I'm just gonna change it into a she shed or alternative structure that is now not a temporary family health care dwelling. I think we're opening a lot up if we try to regulate, is it not? And how do you regulate, who's gonna regulate and make sure that it's no longer being used as a temporary family dwelling, care dwelling. And I guess if we can continue to opt out, I would recommend that we continue to opt out.
Is there a vote on this one?
That's what I was just gonna ask. Do we need a motion or
I
anything?
didn't think, this was a discussion only.
Everything tonight is completely
Okay.
discussion only.
Yeah.
There's no official actions taken. The official action that would be taken by the planning commission would be if there's something specific, like if this is something, so this isn't in our code right now. This is something that you said, hey, we need to have today and get it done, then you'd provide direction to staff to say, hey, can you guys get a public hearing scheduled for it? And then what we would do is we would put it into the current code, which is fine, because that's one of the nice things that we got going on. One of the beautiful things is, though we have a new structure and new layouts and all these amendments and all these additions and things getting pulled and moved and whatnot, it doesn't preclude us from making changes to the existing code and changing our zoning code before we do a full update. The one motion that would be done would be on the entire zoning code as a whole, unless the planning commission would want to make 11 motions. So but that's not something that staff's going to ask for several months.
I mean, it makes sense to do it all at the end, because like we just talked about with the definitions, we're gonna go back and edit stuff as we get through them all.
Totally agree.
We're gonna be like, oh yeah, remember that thing 6 articles ago? We're gonna need to edit that now.
And we haven't, and staff has not published any public hearing stuff. Anything, even if there was a motion, it wouldn't be able to legally hold up because we haven't done any of the legal aspects that we have to be able to make amendments to the zoning code. We will. It'll be a nice big document, a lot of communication stuff going out, a lot of questions we're gonna get later on this year, but for now, it's getting our basis in place.
Step number 1 in general, and then we get to the detail.
We got one more section to go, which is administrative and enforcement at the next meeting. That's gonna include things such as the zoning administrator, the zoning map, the amendment process, public hearings, board of adjustments, nonconformities, land use permits, are the big things on there. So there's a lot of different stuff that's gonna go there, but that's still a foundational piece to the operation of the city code, or excuse me, of the zoning code, as well as the role that everybody has as planning commissioners, and even part of it, staff's role in that interaction.
I don't know if we're wrapping it, like, nice job, guys. I know this is a lot of work. It's probably really tedious. Hopefully you all got your eyes checked a couple times afterwards, and, yeah, nice work.
It's just the beginning.
Yeah.
It is.
But this is more fun than trees.
Trees will be coming back probably around the July, August timeframe. Just to give you a heads up, that's gonna be part of the subdivision code, which even part of that with the municipal code, we're looking at changing that structure and where things are laid out within there. So it's fun. I enjoy this. I know Brian loves this. He likes reading all my notes. So
So your question about the Papa Murphy's type, are you looking for suggestions?
it was just an example to go back because a question came up that we've never done this, where we put in, sorry, I went past it, where we've never had this in our code.
Okay.
We've never put something that says in there, hey, in our code now, we added, which hadn't been in there, saying if it's not specifically listed, then it's not a permitted use. But previously, it would have been, it's close, or something like that could have been done, going all the way back to 1975, probably going back to 1957, and then 61 when the planning commission was formed, or about that time frame. But what that example is Papa Murphy's, can you clearly define it as a use listed in our use table? If the answer is no, then is it close enough to a use where it's worth bringing to the planning commission, to the city council, to say it is gonna be regulated underneath this use. And if the answer is, no, it doesn't fit anything, then the applicant or whoever's asking would then need to do a zoning text amendment and go through that process. So it's a quicker process that doesn't cost any applicant financial strain, just cost time to see if they can get an answer. As a staff, we would love to give one, but we just enforce the code. It's up to the planning commission and the city council to tell us what that code should say and what that community standard should be.
I think, like, personally, I'm in support of this, but I think I'd like to see like a little bit more structure into like what are the steps and like some boundaries around it. Because I could see this going south also, because if we say it's substantially similar use, again, everything we do here sets a precedent. So as soon as you do one, it's going to set us precedent for the next one. And so I think we need to have a little bit of a formal process for us to incorporate this into the code, is my opinion, my feedback. Like, to understand a little bit more about how that looks and what precedent we'd set if we approved one of these.
And Commissioner, the way that it would work is, let's say I want to put a Papa Murphy's in, right? Okay, can't clearly define it to what it is. It's not a restaurant because you don't sit down and eat there. We don't cook food there. It's not a commissary kitchen where we're sending out finished product or anything like that. So it fits into those gray areas between the definitions. I would go to Brian and Jen and I'd say, hey, it doesn't really fit anywhere. Can you tell me what it's supposed to be? Staff would then turn around, come to the planning commission and be like, hey, we have this applicant. They're in the audience. This is what they're looking at doing. Do you see it fitting in any of these categories? And you say, okay, it's close enough, and we think that based on what they're going to do, it's regulated that way. You'd provide a recommendation or not, or the other way. You say, no, that recommendation goes to city council. The city council then takes an official action to say this specific use at this specific, so that if it's a Papa Murphy's, it is a take and bake pizza. That if you create a take and bake pizza, it's going to be regulated as a sit-down restaurant, meaning it's going to have to meet all the performance standards of a sit-down restaurant. Or it is a commissary kitchen, it's how it's going to be regulated. It needs to meet all the performance standards of that commissary kitchen, or however it's defined. So that's where we go. It comes down to the council making that determination of if it's there, and it would get put in writing, and it gets recorded at least in the minutes, if not by resolution.
And so, like, again, so where my thought goes is this, let's stick with the Papa Murphy's example. So then the next applicant who comes is a take and bake pie. I don't know, pick your poison.
Yep.
Now we've set a precedent of, okay, take and bakes are this. So at that point, at what point do enough of these substantial similar uses become code and get written into definitions? Like, that's, I think, what we should look at from like a more global perspective of like, if we do that one, like, what are we saying?
I can provide a direct example if the chair and commission would indulge me for a couple minutes. A few years ago, when I was working with the city of Newport, we had a business come in, and what they did is they were lawn care. They weren't landscaping. They were lawn care. They would fertilize your property. They'd make sure that your flowers are still alive and your grass is really nice and green. But they weren't putting in patios or walkways or anything like that. So it didn't fit in the landscaping, but it didn't fit in a retail use either, or in a professional services definition. So what we did as a city after a couple meetings is we determined, hey, the use isn't substantially close enough to anything we already have. In that case, we actually did a zoning text amendment to create the use. So if it's not close enough, or it becomes something that is going to become repetitive, the option is always there to do a zoning text amendment to get that definition in, to get the regulations use within the code. That could run into some non-conforming things, but if all of a sudden we have 20 different businesses that want to do a take and bake style, then at that point, well, there's a need for the community, there's a want, is the policy window available to something that the city would want to entertain that, and then at that point, zoning text amendment. The city has the right to say no. We don't have to say yes. We can say no. And if we say no to the process of, we're just asking the question, to now we're officially applying for a change.
Gotcha.
And then even at that point, the city can still say, no, it's our city unless there's a statute or federal law that overrules it.
No, that makes sense. Thanks for clarifying the text amendment. That's a good point.
Absolutely.
You just popped something in my head. Where does a food truck fall into play?
So, food trucks. They're interesting. So food trucks, a good example of food trucks would be taking a look at Minneapolis's code, which is fun and exciting because it's massive and covers anything and everything that we could ever think of being this far away. However, food trucks, we could define specifically what a food truck is. And then we could set it up as a primary or secondary use, or excuse me, as an accessory use, and then we can put performance standards on it. We could take the method that the city of Winona does, where they say, hey, if you want to have a food truck, cool, absolutely got to get a permit. By the way, you also need to have a hard stand building within the community to be able to operate a food truck outside of special events and things like that. So there is flexibility, there's different ideas to do it. But when we look at development, would we develop space within the city that we would want to have food trucks or have some type of food truck event? Would that be something that the communications department is looking at, or even community development, or with some the council would want to do, or any type of anybody else within the community, or residents, or the planning commission, whoever? So those would be different things. But if somebody wanted to operate a food truck in town underneath our current rules, it's not permitted because we don't have it listed out. They could then go through a zoning text amendment to allow it. As far as allowing food trucks as part of an event or something along that lines, that would fall underneath a city license, which would then fall underneath the licensing section that we're gonna modify in the municipal code. So it's,
I just know, like, you see them, I mean, Jessica's got a few, Shakopee's got a few where they're parked in a parking lot and they're there all year long. They're not, I mean, they're mobile, and they might move, but.
if they're on private property, it's regulated different. Because at that point, it's not necessarily an accessory use to the business that's there, but it's not a primary use of the parcel either. So at that point, that'd be something that we would look at on the municipal side to say it's permitted or it's not permitted. If we want to permit it as an accessory use, then that becomes a zoning code thing, and then we can set those performance standards. But we can do something similar to performance standards within the municipal code as well. So just because it doesn't fit necessarily in the zoning code, the feedback is great because it helps when we do meetings at the staff level with the municipal code and we're sending it out to all the departments. We're saying, hey, there's this idea, and how do you think we could regulate it? Or how do you think, do we need to regulate it? Do we need to license it? Do we need to do whatever? How would we do that process? And so on and so forth. So this is absolutely great discussion. If anybody wants to talk about zoning cutoff line, I could talk for days on it.
Someday.
In a different establishment, we can do that.
Any other comments or questions about this item tonight? This item does not require formal motion, so we'll move on to the miscellaneous section of our agenda. Staff, you have any miscellaneous items?
Yes, Chair and Commissioners, just a few updates for everyone. The Rogers Behavioral Health application that you saw at your last meeting was withdrawn. So City Council did not consider that application at their last meeting. Looking ahead at our February 18th meeting. Article 2, as Travis mentioned, 1 down, 12 to go. We're doing great. Great discussion tonight. We're also going to look at the West Creek Village preliminary plat, which we continued the public hearing for this evening, as well as a pool variance and an outdoor dining ordinance. So next one's going to be a long one.
Thank you. Commissioners?
adjourn.
Got a motion to adjourn?
Second?
A motion, a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. The motion carries. We are adjourned.